I'm Matthew Affron. I work as the curator of Modern Art at this museum. And it's been my great pleasure to organize the exhibition Dreamworld, Surrealism at 100. The subtitle says it all. The exhibition celebrates the 100th anniversary of the publication in the fall of 1924 in Paris of the Manifesto of Surrealism by André Breton, the document that codified Surrealism as a movement in modern literature and art, and even more as a rebellious philosophy of life. And we've been delighted to partner with the Pompidou Center in Paris. We've been delighted to partner with the Pompidou Center in Paris and 3 other European museums, the Royal Museums of Fine Arts in Brussels, the Mapfre Foundation in Madrid, and the Hamburger Kunsthalle in developing a series of linked exhibitions that told the story of Surrealism. This tour began in early 2024. I had the opportunity to go see all of the previous versions of this exhibition, so I had a big advantage in organizing ours. Each version, each venue told the story of Surrealism in its own way, depending on its own location or its own history with the topic or its own collection. And Philadelphia is no different. We're also the final stop on the tour and the only US venue, which is really a wonderful thing, I think, for us. But why Philadelphia? The short answer of why the exhibition is here really is due to the great strength of our Surrealist collections. We have a deep history with the topic. We have a distinguished collection of Surrealist art. The exhibition that you have seen or will see or will come and see again, and will tell all your friends to come and see on the walls, is about 35% from our permanent collection, though we don't ever have a chance to show so much of our permanent collection of Surrealism in the ordinary course of things. It just means that we brought out some great favorites and also some wonderful things that are usually tucked away, often because they're fragile works on paper that cannot be shown all the time and so forth. And we've used this exhibition as an opportunity to contextualize them with works of art, great works of art on loan from institutions and private collections in Europe and in North and South America, to tell our version of the story of Surrealism. And it's really a unique thing. Why do a traveling show that is not the same in every stop, which is normally the way things go? One of the reasons I think why the Pompidou Center, which launched the project and which invited us to participate and which loaned many great things for which we are very grateful, one of the reasons I think was that this story is just too big to tell in any one show. So in effect, what you have is a series, again, of linked exhibitions, which, though they share some works which travel from place to place, if you could put them together, would tell you a kind of expanded version of this great story. But what was Surrealist art? The answer to that question is not so simple. Surrealism was a modern literary and art movement that burst on the scene in Paris as part of the intellectual and cultural and social ferment that followed World War I. For the young people in the early Surrealist group, and I'm talking about writers and artists who were in their 20s and in their 30s in 1924, the suffering and the destruction that had come with the war undermined any possible faith in European civilization as it was. In other words, in the cultural status quo, but also in the social status quo and the political status quo. The Surrealists reviled mainstream culture as complacent and empty. They opposed prevailing social values and mores as bankrupt. They wanted to challenge the political status quo. And that's what I mean when I say that Surrealism was a movement in modern literature and art, but also more than that, it really was a philosophy of life, or an answer to the question, how should we live? Or how would we want to live? differently from the way we have been living as modern people in the modern world. The poet and writer André Breton codified surrealism as an idea and as a set of beliefs in a small book entitled The Manifesto of Surrealism, as I said, published in Paris in the fall of 1924, 100 plus years ago, the reason for the anniversary that motivated our project. The manifesto begins by asking, again, how should we live? Breton observes that at about 20 years of age, we make the terrible error of trading our childlike imaginations to take up adult good sense and logic. In other words, to become well-adjusted, well-situated, obedient members of society. Yet it is the imagination, he thinks, that allows access to the native state of freedom that we all possess. And freedom, he thinks, Breton, should always be the highest human aspiration. So the problem for him is how to find that state of freedom again. Breton was interested in new methods of poetry. One of them he called automatic writing, comparable to spoken free association done spontaneously and as far as possible without conscious intention. Automatic writing brought stuff buried deep in our unconscious, let's say, up to the fore to change the way we expressed ourselves or spoke or felt or expressed our feelings. He was also interested in Sigmund Freud's discoveries of the role of the unconscious and the interpretation of dreams. Breton thought that by tapping into the power of fantasy and dreams, one might find thrilling new forms of expression in poetry or in art, and through them set oneself against society's narrow values. Visual art was, from the start, a main field of expression of surrealist ideas. Our exhibition tells the story of surrealist art in a sequence that's both chronological, with a time span from around 1920 to around 1960, and thematic, with 6 major sections highlighting different topics in the story of surrealism. And I'm here to offer you a brief overview. Pardon me. And some of the slides have numbers with titles. Those are the titles of the 6 sections. The first one is called Waking Dream. Basically, the first section of the exhibition is a primer, is a survey of some of the principal themes and techniques in surrealist art in works by some of the main figures who came onto the scene at the beginning in the 1920s. And through those figures and those artworks is designed to be a primer for us, for the visitors to the exhibition, into how to look at a surrealist work of art. And I think that will be useful as we continue through the rest of the show and see some of those images and themes and techniques coming back or being modified as things go. So the first section is introduction, but not a background. It's really a survey of the key ways of making images that define surrealism. And that's how it sets the tone for the whole show. It also sets the tone for the show by bringing in a broad mix of kinds of artworks: paintings, sculptures, found object pieces, prints, drawings, photographs, artist books, and film. And you're going to see that pattern in the whole show. It's great. It's a great panoply of different kinds of ways of making art and different sizes of artworks and different mediums and so forth. What you understand immediately in the first section and what you see throughout the remainder, what comes afterwards, is that, and this is an important point, there is no such thing as a singular surrealist style or way of working. And it's interesting because in our art history classes and our museum visits teach us to expect modern art movements to have a certain style. Cubism more or less has a style. Abstract expressionism has a style. There's nothing of the sort in surrealism, because the main point is that any and all methods are good if the work through them accomplishes the basic philosophical goal that Breton articulated in the Manifesto. The underlying goal of surrealism: change the way you see the world. put you in touch with something bigger than what you've encountered before, and so forth. So there's no singular approach or method or style or a way of making images, but a great many of them. And yet there are some general principles. One of the most important of these underlying principles is the concept of the surrealist image as a type of magic window onto an imaginary scene. That means that surrealism replaces the idea of paintings and drawings, and even photographs and films, as representations of the ordinary world, with a concept of the image as a picture of dreams, of hallucinations, or visions coming from the mind's eye. In the Manifesto, Breton talked about something he called the interior model, right? In other words, the job of the image is not to depict what's out there in the tangible world you already know, but it's really about depicting what's in here, believing that the imagination is this resource that can show you more than that other kind of image making. Take, for example, the work of Max Ernst, a German-born artist who settled in Paris in 1922. And this is a collaboration with the poet Paul Eluard. It's an artist book called Misfortunes of the Immortals, published in 1922, with images by Ernst and poems made by both Ernst and Eluard facing each other on the page. He made a sensation in the proto-surrealist world, because it's still in 1922, before the Manifesto, but at a time when some of the main figures are getting to know each other and sticking together in Paris. He made a sensation with his work in the medium of collage, meaning the cutting and then pasting of pre-existing but disparate printed materials on a two-dimensional surface. This spread from this book of poems and collages he co-created with Eluard is a prime example. Ernst liked to use old-fashioned engravings he took from books and magazines as the raw materials for his collages. He liked to combine those fragments in the most disjunctive and irrational ways. This plate from the book is one of the many that puts animal life and humans and modern machinery into bizarre confrontations. It shows a man pedaling a bicycle, or maybe it's a flying machine, which is embedded in the midsection of a supine crocodile. The book's poems are equally collage-like because the two men wrote them by passing sentences back and forth by the mail. So the sentences are joined together, but without any single mind controlling the logic between them. So in fact, there is no ordinary logic between them, but there are many connections to what you see in the images. There are references to crocodiles and adventurers and bicycles in strange combinations in the text. So both the text and the image in this example, and this is why I chose it, exemplify this core surrealist principle that you find in many different kinds of works, 2- and 3-dimensional works in the show, the principle that surprising juxtapositions create the most powerful image. And the more distant the relation between the two juxtaposed things is, the stronger and more surprising the emotional and poetic effect. And I would say that if anyone asks you, what sort of state of mind should I be in as I walk through an exhibition like Dreamworld, I would say that surprise is one of the key surrealist emotions, or an openness to surprise is one of the key surrealist ways of being, because it is surprise which shocks you out of your ordinary way of knowing and suggests something richer, more interesting, more fulfilling. One of the big lessons of section 1 is this. Many of the techniques, the disparate techniques that we find in early surrealism, involved one version or another of working in some kind of distracted or semi-conscious or semi almost hallucinatory state of mind as the beginning. Then, of course, the artists work consciously to complete their works. In the mid-1920s, the Spanish artist Joan Miró was making paintings like this one here, Dog Barking at the Moon, 1926, from our collection. Paintings rendered without any depth in this landscape, any depth or perspective, and people and objects that seem quite abstractly rendered in a way, meaning abstract, meaning detached from the normal way of depicting the tangible world. What we see here is a landscape consisting of flatly painted upper and lower zones or layers. The brown one stands for the earth and the black one stands for the night sky, with just four things shown in it. A dog with a body pieced together from shapes in red, blue, white, and red, blue, white, and yellow. A crescent moon with some of the same colors above. A tall ladder seemingly propped against the night sky, illogically. And then a thing, bird-like, but I'm not going to call it a bird, zooming toward the very tippy top of this impossibly tall ladder. The dog barks, as the title informs us. In a preparatory drawing for this painting, Miró wrote a little cartoon dialogue balloons with the moon's response to the dog's plaintive yelps, "You know, I don't give a damn." It's a simple, humorous, but also emotional scene of longing for the infinite. Longing for the unattainable. But what I think is beautiful is that it's done so simply. A year or two before making this painting, Miró stated that stripping painting down to enigmatic, metaphoric lines and shapes and colors produced results that touched the spirit most directly. Meaning, I think, his own, but also his intended viewers. The most indicative, or one of the most indicative methods of surrealist art in the early years might be the one known as the exquisite corpse, a kind of drawing known as exquisite corpse. It was invented by a group of fellow surrealists in 1925 on the model of a traditional parlor game known in French as Little Papers. Each player draws a part of a standing figure with four parts, with a head, a torso, legs, and feet, taking care to fold the paper to hide what has been drawn before from the next person so that everyone contributes without seeing the whole thing. Though the human body provides a basic structure, a kind of grammatical structure for the work, in the end results, the parts are inevitably mismatched, and the whole body's form is distorted in droll and grotesque ways. It creates monsters. It creates hybrids. It creates impossible figures. And you're looking at an exquisite corpse attributed to two of the prominent early surrealists, Yves Tanguy and André Masson, along with unidentified collaborators, because they didn't sign their names as Tanguy and Masson did. One which has a figure with eyeballs for a head and an exposed heart and a kind of pyramidal skirt and animal feet. Surrealists embraced the exquisite corpse because it dismissed the factor of conscious control and making of the image in two ways. It parceled out authorship to several minds, so no single mind was controlling it, right? And by strengthening the element of surprise and unpredictability. But this idea of monsters is important too, because monsters roam the surrealist imagination from the first. And monsters are a good thing, because they stand for that part of us that is uncontrolled and unruly, and maybe we're a little bit afraid of it. And it's what we nicely brought up and well-adjusted and well-functioning members of society want to keep tamped down. And I'm looking at all of you, and I'm looking at me too, right? And what the surrealists want to do is overturn that relationship. So the hybrid animal, the impossible animal, is a kind of marvel which we aspire to. Moving on to section 2, it's called Natural History. The surrealists believe that the orderly character of modern life, which is what I've been talking about, had a terrible effect because it estranged people from their true nature and their true selves. It made us conform. And these were very nonconformist people, the surrealists. They were the counterculture of their day. Right? Their job was to try to disturb the status quo, culturally and socially and politically. It turns out, if you look at surrealism, that there's a lot of emphasis on depicting nature. Nature has a big role. And what they're looking for in nature is marvels, or oddities, or the sublime, things that are strange and shocking, and that again shake us out of our normal habits of seeing the world. Nature seemed to offer a way to cultivate that part of the self, as a subject that is, that remains primitive and bestial and beyond reason. Good thing for surrealists. So the importance of nature themes. One of the ways to explore this idea was to depict the prototypical shapes of nature and their patterns, the patterns and shapes of plants or living organisms and bodies, things associated with the underlying principles or genesis of life. The surrealists also look for wonders and marvels in the sublime in nature. If you see a surrealist landscape, chances are the laws of perspective are going to be a little bit dislocated, or the point of view is going to be vertiginous. It's going to want to carry you away in some way. Joseph Cornell, a largely self-taught artist who came into the New York art world in the early 30s when surrealism was first gaining traction, real traction there, had a spiritual version of nature. One of his obsessions was the transcendental beauty of astronomy, the night sky, and the heavens. He gazed at the stars from the backyard of his house in the borough of Queens. He liked to go to the Hayden Planetarium. He liked to go to Grand Central Station and look up at the great ceiling in the main hall, which is a great star chart. He sought to convey his feeling for astronomy in works like this one, Untitled Constellation, 1958. Parenthetically, this section has a wide chronological range from the 20s to the 50s. So does the next one. Some of the sections are more narrow, some are broader, depending on the theme. The signature medium for Cornell of shadow boxes, three-dimensional wooden containers, glass-fronted, containing collage-like assemblages of found materials. When it's a three-dimensional collage, we call it assemblage sometimes, but it's the same principle of collage, of bringing together things that don't belong together into a new arrangement. When Cornell combined things in these glass-fronted containers, ordinary objects took on an aesthetic and even a metaphysical effect. In this example, a large white ball rolls back and forth along a horizontal track in the upper area. Let's see if I can make this work. Middle area. And in four cordial glasses, little marbles become, when juxtaposed with this copy of an old zoomorphic sky atlas, they become no longer marbles, but celestial bodies. These tiny things become vast and fascinating. They become models of planets and stars. Section 3, desire. The surrealists believe that just as dreaming provided access to our inner feelings, eroticism, sexuality opened a path to our deepest desires. They saw sexuality as a liberating power, a force for challenging social taboos, a force for the emancipation of people. The third section, desire, examines how eroticism serves as a theme of central importance in experimental surrealist painting, sculpture, photography, and objects. With a lot of photography, because you just find so many fantastic examples of, especially using unorthodox techniques, photographic techniques. The age-old theme of the nude human figure is really reinvented in surrealism. On the left is 2 pages from a 1935 photo book by the photographer Man Ray and the poet Paul Eluard, the same one we saw working with Max Ernst earlier. And by the way, books are illustrated books are an important sort of thread in this show, because they bring together word and image, poetry and photography or printmaking, and really make the point that surrealism at least bridges literature and art, right? And their interconnections are very powerful. In any case, the book contains 5 lyrical love poems by Eluard to Noosh Eluard, the poet's wife, and a professional artist model, and the model in the photographs in the book. Thus, she is a third collaborator in the book. The poems describe her beauty as beyond everyday reality, and the photographs use unconventional techniques to describe that beauty beyond everyday reality, using double exposure or solarization, which is a process where you turn the light on in the middle of developing your photograph, which is normally a no-no. But what you get is an image where where positive form becomes as ethereal as the space around it, with a very, very beautiful contour line in between. That's not what I'm showing you here, though. So I'm just describing sort of these methods and how ephemeral and beautiful they are. You'll have to go see it in the show. The point is to infuse her body with a more ineffable sensuality. The poetic and visual images in the book elevate the idea of woman, it must be said, in terms of male desire. And some of the works, many of the works in this section do that. But at the same time, and I'm saying this because people sometimes come to me, and this happened to me twice in tours in the past 2 days, and they come and they say, but isn't Surrealism just a sexist art movement? And you're entitled to your opinion. But if you're asking my opinion, the answer is no, because it is a wide, capacious thing with artists working with many points of view in which women artists claimed a lot of space. And it turns out that women surrealists also took up the image of the nude figure, a female figure, and engaged with the power of sexuality on their own terms. And so the answer cannot just be yes in my book, but that it's many things. In any case, and the example is that in the show, when you're looking at this book by Man Ray and Elouard, on the other side of the room, but in the sight line, are two photo collages by Nusha Elouard, the model, who had a production of photo collage of her own. And interestingly, usually she depicted, this artist model depicted nude women, as in this example, Untitled from 36, where she cut out and juxtaposed a photograph of a classic femme fatale, or dangerous, alluring woman, like this with the skull, and glued it onto a plate from a 19th century astronomy book showing two views of Saturn, thereby projecting the nude figure into a surrealist beyond. Right? That's an example of this dynamic I'm talking about. So surrealism began in literature and art, but its perspective extended to society and politics from the beginning. These were counterculture people. These were engaged people in their thinking. It's not by accident that the first Surrealist magazine published in Paris in 1925 to start was called the Surrealist Revolution, but then it was succeeded by another magazine at the end of the 20s called Surrealism in the Service of the Revolution, when the Surrealists some of them moved close to the Communist Party. Some of them were really committed leftists, and all of them were certainly in revolt against the middle of the road of their own time. Section 4, titled Premonition of War, borrowing the subtitle from this painting by Salvador Dalí, switches gears with respect to the two previous sections in terms of its point of view and its outlook. Section 2 and Section 3 on the prevalence of nature and the question of eroticism and sexuality are really about lyrical feelings. They're about poetic feelings in front of nature, or personal feelings in terms of love and sex and gender and so forth. And so they can feel more about the individual than anything else. But Surrealism has other perspectives and points of view too. And so we try to move the exhibition along by changing emotional registers or these viewpoints as you go, so that you can start to see certain threads or even contrasts within what is going on in Surrealist art. So anyway, Section 4, titled Premonition of War, switches gears to focus on the question of how did Surrealist artists respond to socio-political reality in the 1930s, to matters of big, epic public concern, rather than more personal ones, as I just mentioned. Specifically, how did they respond in their art to the conflicts that engulfed Europe in that decade, from the Spanish Civil War in the mid of the 1930s, widely seen, the Spanish Civil War, which pitted the democratically elected leftist government of Spain against the nationalists led by Francisco Franco, who ultimately overthrew the government in 1939 and became Spain's dictator, working with the support of Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. A conflict that was widely seen as a struggle between fascism and anti-fascism in Europe, and ultimately culminating in World War II in September 1939. How did the Surrealist artists respond to all that in their art? Dalí's painting from our collection is one of the most famous examples of such a response. It's a harrowing allegory of a nation divided within itself, and an iconic depiction of the impulse to self-destruction. What you have is, in the setting of a barren plain in Catalonia, the region in Spain where Dalí came from, the Empordà del Plain, you have a colossus looming over the landscape, a colossus made up of mostly mismatched arms and legs. One hand serves as a foot, the other foot props up an arm, a hand throttles a breast. The hands and feet appear to be calcifying or putrefying. The monster's head pitches back with an anguished grimace. Now, I would say that this makes sense, really, if you've seen Exquisite Corpses and if you've seen monsters in Surrealist art, which you have in the exhibition. If monsters are a good thing because they are a sign of the unruly, bestial part of us from the beginning, in the 30s, they acquire another meaning without losing the first one, and that is they become the symbols for use by the Surrealists to depict the evil that is falling over Europe. The section shows how artists from Pablo Picasso, who was associated with Surrealism in this decade strongly, and Joan Miró and Dalí, who are all from Spain, and others invoked an imagery of monsters and barbarism and irrationality and violence to face what they took to be a world crisis in the 1930s. Now, it seemed appropriate to me that each museum participating in the Centennial Exhibition project tell the story of Surrealism in its own way with a distinct point of emphasis, since the topic is so vast. Section 5, though there are some works, a few works in it that appeared in the other versions, Section 5 as a whole is the unique piece of the exhibition that we created for our iteration of the show. And it reflects some of the great strengths of our modern collection. What it's about is what it does is it follows Surrealist artists who were part of a great diaspora of artists and intellectuals who escaped France in 1939 after the fall of France to the German forces and the division of France into two zones, the occupied and the free zone, with the Germans in charge in the north and the collaborationist Vichy government in the south. A whole cohort of Surrealists within a larger cohort of modern artists, intellectuals, and others escaped, and many of them went to North America in 1939, 40, 41, 42. Mexico became an important safe haven for some of these artists, and New York from 1941 to about 1947 was the world capital of Surrealism. And this is important because what we're talking about is one aspect also of the internationalization of Surrealism. If Surrealism was so durable, it was not just because it lasted so long from 1924, let's say, as the date from the Manifesto, at least till André Breton's death in 1966. And some people say they're still continuing the legacy today, but also because it covered the world. Right? And it was able, more than almost any other avant-garde group of the 20th century, to take on new generations of artists working not just in Paris, but in many places. And this section is part of that story. So we look in our section at Mexico and New York in the 40s and how Surrealism sort of bloomed in those places during these very terrible times. André Breton had visited Mexico in 1938 to do a lecture tour about Surrealism in Mexico. And that was when he took up Frida Kahlo as an artist who represented surreality in Mexico's distinctive mythology, ecology, history, and visual culture. And so we have this wonderful painting as the example of that, entitled My Grandparents, My Parents, and I, Family Tree from 1936. Kahlo depicts her in herself. It's autobiographical, like many of her works, but it's more than that. She depicts herself in 3 stages of her young life. In the lower left-hand part of the picture as an ovum at the instant of fertilization. And that connects back to the section on natural history and going to the sources of life as a kind of metaphor of the sources of the self, among other things. As a fetus, incongruously visible outside her mother's abdomen, in a little just above on the left-hand side of the picture, and as a naked child in the bottom who towers over her childhood home, the Casa Azul in Mexico City. The picture has a look of a family tree, and it is a kind of family tree because it depicts on the right side, her German ancestry through her father, and on the left side, her indigenous Mexican ancestry through her mother. And that means that it's a picture of what they call in Mexico mestizaje, which is the mixing of peoples. That was a very, very important part of Mexican identity, especially in the wake of the 1910 Mexican Revolution. At any rate, we highlight different kinds of surrealist images of the Mexican landscape and other Mexican artifacts by both exile and artists who were already there. And then face that off with a great wall of works made by artists who were reacting to surrealism in New York in the 40s. There were 2 main points of overlap between the surrealists in exile and the younger local artists based in New York who took an interest in surrealist ideas and methods. The first point of overlap was an interest in myths as tales of supernatural beings that bring insight into the deepest questions of human existence. Interestingly, these myths did not have to only be classical myths, right? But they could also be North American myths. As they are in this painting by Jackson Pollock entitled Male and Female, 1942. An abstruse painting which drew on Pollock's long-held interest in the expressive forms and mythological concepts of Native American art, which he admired from his childhood in the West, to arrive at an image of 2 figures that mirror each other. They're the vertical figures in the center, with a combination of male and female attributes. The idea is that they come together to make a new unified self. Cryptic markings and spontaneous brushstrokes evoke surrealist techniques, which Pollock once described as the contribution of the European emigres he most admired. But it also, and this is what's important, has a North American basis through his interest in, for example, shamanism, an ancient spiritual practice involving entering into an altered state of consciousness to speak with the spirit world, which someone in a surrealist point of view might relate also to something like the unconscious. And they did. A strong interest in the mythical and the supernatural ran through surrealism from the beginning, and now I'm moving to a conclusion. Don't worry, but with section 6, magic art. Strong interest in mythical and the supernatural ran through surrealism. The final major section, called magic art, focuses on the use of those themes by surrealists to try to bring a sense of enchantment back to the world after the destruction of World War II. So the exhibition begins with all of this birth of surrealism after World War I, and it ends with the aftermath of the Second World War. The painting here, Birthday by Dorothea Tanning in our collection, made in 1942, is the self-portrait of a young artist being reborn as a surrealist. She depicts herself as a type of sorceress, wearing an 18th century skirt, which if you look closely is made up of plant tendrils and little naked human bodies. And she's accompanied by a winged animal, a kind of familiar, which tells you that she is a kind of witch or sorceress. Max Ernst, surrealist from the beginning, who had come as one of the exiles to New York, came upon the picture during a studio visit. In Tanning's memoirs, she said that he suggested the title Birthday to capture the underlying theme of the artist reborn in a surrealist realm of the unknown, symbolized by the endless sequence of doorways and thresholds that you see in the background. The exhibition ends, and the section in the exhibition ends with a set of works by two women, Leonora Carrington and Remedios Varo, who, working as exiles from England and Spain through Paris, respectively, lived as emigres in Mexico and focused on magic, the occult, and alchemy to seek out spiritual wholeness and imagine a more just and humane existence in their art. Carrington's The Pleasures of Dagobert is a landscape teeming with vignettes, too many to describe, but they're all figments of the imagination of the titular figure Dagobert, a medieval French king. And if you see echoes of medieval art in this picture, you are right. But it's a modern kind of medievalism that goes together with that goes together in this artist's work. And finally, another painting with roots in historical art, but very modern too, by Varo is this cabinet with an image inside in the form of a Byzantine icon by Remedios Varo, which exemplifies her pursuit of the spiritual and art. It's constructed like an icon, but the image inside is not a Christ or the Virgin Mary or a saint as it would be traditionally. It shows a fantastical machine for spiritual discovery being carried out towards the cosmos. The exhibition closes at this point. When did Surrealism end? Many people say that Surrealism ends when André Breton dies in 1966 in Paris, or when the Paris Surrealist group dissolves itself officially in 1969, but there are people in the world who say that they're continuing Surrealist activities till today. And I hope, really, that this exhibition will connect with us today. And I thank you.
Great. And if anyone has any questions, I see hands are already raising. So 1 and 2, and if other people think of questions, we'll keep going.
Thank you so much for your remarks and putting this together. Could you discuss a little bit more of the Surrealism importance to and influence on the literature and art of the 60s and 70s?
Well, that's a really huge question. So thank you so much for giving me an easy one. The point really is that even as early as the 1940s, Surrealism starts to infiltrate culture. It's in the water. Anyone who saw Hitchcock's Spellbound remembers the dream sequence designed by Salvador Dalí. And so in the 40s, sure, and in the 60s, definitely. You know, you look at rock and roll posters of the 60s, it's full of Victoriana, even older, right? And full of surrealism. And I think the point is that this is the counterculture of the 20s. And that's why it made some sense in the 60s. That's the short answer. Thank you.
What special considerations did you have to consider in terms of conservatorship and protecting the works while they're here? In terms of the atmosphere, lighting, and things like that.
I could tell you, but they'd have to kill me. Any great exhibition like this has all kinds of interesting questions of conservation, but I'll tell you one. I wish I had a slide of it. There's a wonderful sculpture by Alexander Calder, which has been in our collection since 1950, but which has not been on view for a long time because it's very delicate. It's a mobile with bits of broken teacups and wine glasses and wine bottles suspended so delicately on these threads, and it rotates, and suddenly it's a universe. So, and since Calder was in some of the early Surrealist exhibitions, this American artist, and was friends with people like Miró, it's totally okay to put him in a Surrealist show, even though Surrealism does not define him entirely. Ever since I came here to work 12 years ago, I've been bugging my wonderful colleagues in sculpture conservation. Can't we please get the Calder back on view? But it was really tricky. Then along came this exhibition, and it gave me the ammunition I needed to make it basically impossible for them to say no. And so they did this miracle of bringing it back to life. what's today, Saturday? So last week at some point, they installed it on this pedestal in the middle of the second gallery on nature, right? And I didn't know. I came into the galleries, we were doing installation the next day. I walked in, I walked in unprepared, fainted, got up and sent them an email saying how much I appreciated it. And when you go in and you see it, you will know what I mean.
Can you talk about how the destruction and the new world order that resulted from the Great War, World War One, helped propel the popularity of surrealism, and how it might also have parallels to art, following what's happening today in the world?
Well, okay, that's also thank you also for a simple question. I would say that surrealism, one of the ways to look at surrealism is as one of the great avant-garde movements of the 20th century. Now, the word avant-garde actually comes originally, its etymology originally, well, one of its meanings is it is the forward, the advanced scout part of an army, which goes towards enemy territory first. In other words, the most dangerous possible position, right? Avant-garde artists, their job is to be ahead of their time, right? These people, most of them had been in the war, and they were extremely they were disgusted by it, and they thought that their society needed to be really shaken up, and so they took it upon themselves to be the avant-garde of what might be a better future, right? Not only in terms of literature and art, but in terms of society and everything else. And they could only continue doing that by remaining relevant. So even after you get past World War II, and now you're 20 years into the history, one of the things they had to do, Breton and his friends, was try to prove to the world that even though there are other avant-garde movements coming up behind them, existentialism, notably in Paris after World War II, they were still alive and well. So they made big exhibitions and they produced art and so forth. And so I would say that, they lived through, they and everyone else lived through two great cataclysms. And their oppositional stance to the status quo was very framed by those cataclysms.
To ask about a more like curation related question on because a lot, I guess, a big chunk of surrealism is about the disruption and this force of spatial awareness almost. Like, how do you consider that into your curation process of the space, how you display and how you represent that?
It would be easier for me to answer you if we were in the space, right? But when you go in, you will see that this is not an exhibition where everything is just kind of marching along in one line from the beginning to the end. We try to use the space creatively. We have works of art that are very high up on the wall that hang from the ceiling even. And we try to we also use strong colors to create very strong moods. The lighting is fantastic and is very, very important for that. So every aspect, I would say, of the design of the galleries has been thought to try to properly frame the incredible works that you're seeing in the show, and I wouldn't do it exactly the same way for a different topic.
Thank you very much for the talk.
I was just curious about how, when exploring the international component of the Surrealist movement, what was the process like of selecting artists, both known and unknown, from beyond Paris, for example, who both epitomized but also challenged some of the conventions that had been established prior?
Now you're really asking me to give away my secrets. Thank you. So, we did our best in this exhibition to really mix some works by famous artists that you've seen in your art history books, right? And people are coming to me and saying, I cannot believe it because I saw this 25 years ago in class and I never thought that, which is wonderful, right? And then we have it alongside something by an artist who I didn't even know barely or even not at all when I started the research, and the putting together of the show. And I think it's very, very good to have that mix for this kind of project because Surrealism was it was not a little narrow group of people. It was a universe of people. And there are people who are still remain to be discovered. Also, we have a lot of women artists, and that is to reflect a reality, which is that women artists cleared a lot of space for themselves in Surrealism and were important in Surrealist exhibitions and publications and so forth, especially from the 1930s onward and more from the 1930s onward. But I think that if this exhibition had been done 30 years ago, you were less likely to see them because that is a phenomenon that is based in what feminist art history has accomplished in the last 30 years or so, which is to make us aware of some great artists who were not given that status necessarily at the beginning. So those are some of the choices, right? And I've tried to also at least shed some light on artists who are working outside of Paris and Europe, and in Mexico and in New York and so forth. And it's just to give a kind of broad perspective, but I certainly am not implying that we're doing anything exhaustive because again, the topic is just too big. There was a wonderful exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe you saw it, that was about sort of global surrealism. And they really tried to do the global story. And it was great. But I bet there's more to do, right? And that's just in the nature of the topic.
Any final questions? We have one in the front.
Can you expand a little bit on the era of Freud and his colleagues, which really expanded the interpretation of dreams for the first time?
Well, that's also a vast question, but I'll answer it by saying that what's interesting is that some of the surrealists, including Breton and Salvador Dalí, definitely read Freud, right? And Freud started being translated into French in the period that we're talking about. And what's interesting is that they admired him and took him seriously, but they also read him against the grain. He wanted to cure people. Surrealists were not trying to cure you exactly, right? They were trying to find, they were interested in finding artistic techniques that would have some of the structure and the logic of the dream work that Freud described sort of scientifically, right? And what's fascinating is that out of this reflection on some of Freud's ideas, they developed extremely innovative ways of making images, right? He didn't necessarily appreciate surrealist art. He had a more classical aesthetic, but that's not their problem, right? What's interesting is that he became fodder for something quite different. But it's also interesting, I think, that the 20s, 30s, and 40s is a time when Freudianism becomes very widespread in the culture. And it's not only the surrealists who are looking at psychoanalysis. They're part of something much bigger too.
Wonderful. Well, we're just at time. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the Barness family for your support. And thank you, Matthew.